Welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of The Washington Examiner. If you're joining us on YouTube, please subscribe and like our page. I'm joined today by Jim Antle, who is the executive editor of the print magazine. And Jim, let's talk about this extraordinary scandal that has exploded into public view of the cover-up about various failings of Joe Biden. Conservative media have been reporting for years that he has been in cognitive decline, that he was too old to be president. We were doing that back in 2020.
Right.
Finally, the left liberal media were catching up and admitting that there was this, but it was being presented as a cover-up by the White House.
Right.
And just as perhaps the most explosive book on this subject was coming out, we also learned that Joe Biden has advanced prostate cancer and probably has had it for as much as 10 years and almost certainly throughout the presidency. So the physical decline that we saw was very much not the biggest aspect of his physical ailments. He was suffering from decline. He apparently didn't have a PSA test for the past decade.
Right.
So talk a bit about the scale of the scandal and the story that we're looking at here as it relates both to the cover-up of his deficiencies on mental deficiencies and physical deficiencies.
So there are really a couple of facets to this story that I think are fascinating. One is, obviously the White House did everything they could to conceal his condition, to minimize his condition, to minimize his exposure to the public. But there really is only so much you can do if he's the President of the United States.
Right.
So a lot of these media outlets behaving as if only the White House had told them. There certainly is a White House transparency aspect to this story, especially with regard to the prostate cancer diagnosis. It's very difficult to give them the benefit of the doubt on any of these questions. But Biden was on television frequently enough, and he'd been on television for decades. So we had a real strong basis to compare how he performed day to day to how he spoke as a senator, how he spoke as a 3-time presidential candidate, how he spoke as a 2-term vice president for 8 years. And even just looking at, say, for example, his masterful vice presidential debate performances, anything he did in the 2020 Democratic primaries, and certainly that disastrous debate with Donald Trump, it's very, very clear something had changed in him.
Right. And that is the fascinating aspect of this, that there was obviously a White House cover-up. People were covering things up. But that cover-up could not have happened unless there was a complicit media very much willing to go along with it. And there's a clip that is being constantly played right at the moment of Jake Tapper at CNN, who is a co-author of the explosive book that we just mentioned, dismissing suggestions of cognitive decline.
I think what we see on stage with Joe Biden, Jake, is very clearly a cognitive decline.
Okay.
That's what I'm referring to. It makes me uncomfortable
You are
to
no
watch somebody on stage
that's so amazing. It's so amazing to me that
try and figure out an answer.
A cognitive decline.
Well, when you're trying to tell me that what I was suggesting was
I think that you were mocking his stutter. Yeah, I think you were mocking his stutter, and I think you have absolutely no standing to diagnose somebody's cognitive decline.
So what we have here is the recognition and the exposure in front of the public that there has been something very nefarious going on with the governance of the country, with the officials in the White House. And it has confirmed that the media has been facilitating this, and it absolutely endorses the extraordinary public distrust and mistrust of the media, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So, if the maximalist claims about the former president's health are true, and there was some knowledge of the prostate cancer, some fear that he might have that condition in the White House, that's certainly an enormous scandal and a significant lack of transparency on the part of his team. But in terms of trying to shield him from overexposure of how he was slowing down, how he was becoming less effective as a communicator. Those are sorts of things that a political staff for a politician would be expected to do.
Right.
They're at least trying to present their candidate in the most favorable light they possibly can. That's not what the media is supposed to be doing at all.
No.
And I think when you look at the fact that any talk of cognitive decline outside of conservative media was routinely shouted down or downplayed, and that even some of these discussions were treated as if these were deceptively edited videos, cheap fakes.
Right.
But then the narrative turns immediately after the debate where Biden is suddenly a liability to the Democratic Party. And now you have very, very tough coverage of Biden, as if he were Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump.
Right.
Very tough coverage, helps force him out of the race. And then the coverage of the Democratic candidate immediately becomes fawning again once he's replaced.
Exactly. So to use political motifs, it's perfectly clear that a lot of the media has been willing to do the donkey work for the donkey party.
Right.
It's interesting to see also the way that that Democrats responded as soon as the cancer diagnosis was revealed. You had David Axelrod, who was a kind of political fixer and campaign guru for President Obama. You had Hakeem Jeffries, minority leader in the House, immediately saying, this is terribly sad news, which indeed it is, and we hope President Biden beats the cancer. But that sad news should mean that we should suspend or mute discussion of the cognitive decline and the cover-up. They immediately wanted to try and move on from that discussion to get past the scandal. And this reminds me very much of when President Clinton was under fire in the White House. The White House staff then would say, that's a lie, this is speculation, there's no truth in this. And then once it was shown that there was truth in all that, they said, oh, that's old news, we shouldn't have to talk about it.
Right.
This is exactly what the Democrats are doing right now. This thing which they denied for years, 5 years, 6 years, however long it was that people like us were first writing about it, it's not true, it's not true, it's not true. Now it's exploded into the public view. Everyone can see that it was true, that there was media complicity, and the Democrats are now saying, "Oh, we should move on." But in fact, and this is where I'm going with this question, the Democrats have to face up to what they were doing in covering up for Biden. Things have been going wrong as far as the Democrats and sort of election competition and honesty ever since the primary in 2020, when essentially the establishment decided no longer to compete. Everyone suddenly backed Biden. You know, even Bernie Sanders was not really much of an insurgent in at that time.
Right.
The Democrats have to face up to what they have been doing. It's been a fraud on the democracy of this country, and everybody knows it, and they're not going to get past it in this way, are they?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're asking to move on from the story at the precise moment the story is arguably getting much worse, right? So the entirety of Joe Biden's revived political career from 2019 on would likely be impossible if there wasn't sort of this conspiracy of silence around his condition.
Right.
If he wasn't given favorable media coverage, if the pandemic did not allow him to avoid most normal campaign appearances, if he wasn't in a situation where the staff was able to hide him and be hugely selective about his media appearances, it's really unlikely that he would have ever been able to be president of the United States, much less stay in that office for all 4 years.
Right, right. So if I could throw back to an even earlier scandal, the Watergate scandal, where we are now is early. It's sort of at the point where there's a connection made between the president and the burglars at the Democratic National Headquarters.
Right.
There needs to be congressional hearings about this. Who was actually making decisions? Who was really running the government? Right. If you had a figurehead president who didn't really know what was going on, whose name was being subscribed to all sorts of policies, it's really important that there is some accountability so that public trust in the system can be restored.
Absolutely, and Democrats should want this themselves because this created the conditions for Donald Trump to rehabilitate himself politically. And if they're going to argue that Trump is some kind of unique threat to democracy, they need to own up to their part in why he's been an effective political figure. And when you look at the fact that Biden was allowed to cover all of this up, and even if you concede that maybe he had his good days and his bad days, as is likely the case and is often true of older people as they enter in some form of decline. Well, what was going on during the bad days?
Right.
And the best case scenario is simply decisions were being deferred and delayed until he had another good day.
Right.
Right? Which is not a great scenario, but it's the best case scenario. And the worst case scenario is people nobody elected are making these decisions in the interim.
Yeah.
And we deserve to know, we have a right to know who those people were.
Yeah. You mentioned the rehabilitation of President Trump being facilitated by the Democrats' efforts to defeat him using President Biden, covering up for President Biden. Let's move on to President Trump and the big, beautiful bill that is now on Capitol Hill and looks reasonably close to being passed by the House. President Trump tried to lay down the law with the Republicans who are in blue states, in Democrat-run states, who insisted on raising the state and local tax deduction. He was reported to have used some pretty tough language with them, which we won't go into or quote on this show. But it ended up, it looks as though there is a deal where the blue state Republicans have actually won, and that the state and local tax deduction will go up from a cap of $10,000 a year to $40,000 a year, which is a quadrupling and a pretty big win for the SALT Republicans. So, it shows, does it not, that President Trump wasn't able to overcome some of the opposition that he has up on Capitol Hill, and it also shows that there is a greater willingness amongst Republicans to recomplicate the tax structure of the country, isn't there?
Yes, I think that's true. An unfortunate reality is that a lot of Republican gains that have happened since the midterm elections have happened in blue states.
Right.
They made a number of gains in the House in New York and New Jersey and California, and obviously they'd like to keep those seats, but right now the majority is dependent on blue state Republican lawmakers whose seats are much less safe than the conservatives who have objections both to the SALT deductions and also to just the larger spending trajectory of the reconciliation bill. So they are much more likely to make concessions to these members because their seats are most at risk.
Right, they're able to say, look, you owe the majority to us. And it's always the people who are most vulnerable to losing their seats who have the most leverage over the leadership. But Jim, thanks very much for being here. That's where we'll leave it. Thank you all for joining us on Political Perspectives. Please come back and join us next time.